Let's talk now about a little act of compassion. Compassion. We read a lot about that in the Bible, especially from Jesus' point of view, where he had compassion on the people. Even back when we talked about the feeding of the 5,000, one of the Gospels talks about how he was moved with compassion for the people because he could see they wanted to be with him. They wanted to learn from him. They wanted to be healed by him. And he was moved with compassion. And we're supposed to follow that attribute. We're supposed to be like Christ in that way. And there is a story in 2 Kings chapter 5 about a man called Naaman. Now, Naaman, from just reading his account, doesn't sound like the nicest of people. He sounds a little bold, a little arrogant, maybe even a little bit selfish. But he had a little maid from Israel, a little maid, and she gave a little advice to Naaman, even though he was basically her lord or her master. She spoke up and gave him some advice, and that advice changed his life. Again, I encourage you to read the whole chapter because it's really powerful and there's a lot that takes place in here, and we just don't have time to cover all of it. Maybe in another series we'll try to cover that because it is one of my favorite stories. But for now, let's look at 2 Kings 5. Let's look at verses 1 through 4, and then we'll jump down to 14. Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God, my Lord, were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. Now jump down to verse 14. Then went he, that's Naaman, down, and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So Naaman was a great man. He had all these things going for him. He was a mighty man. He was a warrior, this and that and the other. But he was a leper. And leprosy was a horrible, horrible disease. He was unclean. And because of that, he was cut off from a lot of society, not to mention just feeling horrible all the time, I'm sure. So this little maid in the household, a slave basically, says, Well, I know of this prophet in Israel that could help him. And she tells the mistress, and the mistress tells the servants, and the servants tell Naaman. And then there's this whole thing that goes back and forth where Naaman goes to the king, and then that king goes to the other king. And finally, he gets to the house of Elisha. And when he finally gets there, Elisha tells him to go dip in the Jordan 7 times. And of course, Naaman doesn't like the idea of that because the Jordan was nasty and it was gross. And besides which, what good was that going to do? Was kind of Naaman's thought, what good is it going to do for me to dip in the Jordan because I have leprosy? That's not going to do any good. But he did it. And it did a lot of good because he was healed. Now, we could talk about Naaman's obedience, but he's not the one I want to talk about. I want to talk about the little maid with the little advice. She was nobody. She was a slave. She was insignificant. Nobody had to listen to her. She was very bold for even speaking up because that wasn't really something you did. But she spoke up and she told him about this prophet. They could do miracles. She gave a testimony of what she knew God could do through this man. And because of her testimony, because this little maid was willing to open her little mouth and give a little advice to this man, he was healed. And I don't know that we could do or say anything in our lives and in our walk that would necessarily bring someone physical healing, but it might. But we could certainly bring people spiritual healing. If we were willing to open our mouth and give our testimony, we could certainly bring somebody to spiritual healing. We just have to be willing to be used of God. Moses gave the argument to God. He said, "But Lord, I don't speak well, so don't use me." But God didn't buy it. God used him anyway, and God can use us just like he used this little maid.